bridge creaked. It wasn't a new sound. It was a sound that Wood had been making for many years, every time someone stepped on it carrying extra weight. But that afternoon, with the fine rain falling from a closed sky the colour of lead, the creak sounded different. It sounded like a warning. The slave was bent over in the middle of the bridge, her back arched like a bow someone had pulled too tight. Her hands firm on her knees, her bare feet feeling the wet wood like a blind man searching for the way home. And on top of her, mounted the way you mount an animal, the mistress stared straight ahead. She didn't look down. She didn't look at the slave. She didn't look at the river that ran muddy and furious below, swollen by the rains of the past weeks. The mistress stared straight ahead, like someone standing on a platform, in a parade, in a place where everyone had to see that she was more than they were. The slave's eyes were lowered, and the river down below was waiting. To understand what happened on that bridge, you have to go back. Go far back. Go back to the day that slave first arrived at the plantation. A girl of about 17, thin as a young ipe branch, climbing down from a wagon with her hands tied and her feet caked with dried mud. It was a sugarcane plantation in the Reconcavo of Bahia, one of those with more than 200 souls working from sunrise to sundown. The big house was white, with a wide veranda, and on the veranda, the first time the slave saw her, was the mistress. Sitting in a rocking chair, looking at the newcomer the way you look at a fly that flew in through the window. The mistress was 30-something back then. She was beautiful in a hard way. Black hair pulled into a tight bun, and a mouth. The mouth was what stood out the most. A thin mouth, always twisted at one corner, like someone who had just tasted spoiled food. They said, all over the region, that mouth had two specialities. The first was a sharp tongue. The mistress didn't speak with people. The mistress spoke about people. And when she spoke, she cut. The second speciality was her hatred for other people's filth. And here's the detail that changes everything. It wasn't poverty she despised. It was people themselves. Because poverty, deep down, anyone can fall into. But to the mistress, a slave wasn't a person. A slave was a tool with the inconvenience of breathing, of sweating, of taking up space, of existing in the corners of the house when she wanted the house to be clean of any human presence other than her own. The slave from the bridge learned this on the very first day. She had tried to greet her. She bowed her head, lowered her eyes, and murmured a, "Good morning, mistress," so soft it barely came out. The mistress was in the kitchen. She had a dish towel in her hand, and when she heard the greeting, she didn't answer. She threw the towel, right at the slave's face. Right in the face. And she said, without raising her voice, without any effort, like someone making a comment about the weather, "Don't talk to me. Ever." The slave stood frozen. The towel fell to the floor, and in that moment, she understood something she would carry for the next 11 years. 11 years, 2 months, and a few days that she counted every week, scratching the senzala wall with a piece of charcoal. She understood that there, in that house, she was nobody, and being nobody hurt. It hurt like a wound that doesn't close. The humiliation became routine, and routine for those who suffer is the worst kind of torture, because it stops being a surprise. Orders shouted in front of visitors, so the visitors could see that the mistress had authority. Food thrown on the floor, and the slave forced to gather it on her knees, with her hands, with no plate, no cloth, while the mistress remarked to the other slaves that this one didn't even deserve the privilege of eating standing up. Doubled work as punishment for anything at all. A wrong glance, a slow step, a breath heard at the wrong moment. One time, the slave sneezed while serving coffee. It was a small sneeze, muffled. She tried to hold it in but couldn't. The mistress looked at her, said nothing at the time, but that night she ordered the slave to wash, alone, every single sheet in the big house. There were 12 beds, each bed with 3 sets of sheets, 36 pieces of large cloth, in the river, in the dark, with the ash soap burning her hands. The slave finished at dawn, her fingers bleeding, her eyes red, and when she came back to the house, the mistress said without looking at her, "Now iron them all. I want the sheets on the beds before lunch." The slave ironed the sheets, and even so, that day she did not cry, because crying is a luxury, and luxury in that house was something the mistress did not share. But there was one humiliation the mistress reserved with particular pleasure, a humiliation she had invented herself, and one she was so proud of that she told her friends about it, laughing, as though it was some kind of cleverness. The humiliation of the bridge. The bridge sat on the road that connected the plantation to the village where the church stood, and the general store, and the friend's house. It was an old bridge of dark wood with planks that creaked when stepped on. Beneath it ran the river, a river that in summer was gentle and in winter was a beast. It wasn't a long bridge. Anyone walking at a normal pace would cross it in less than a minute, but the mistress did not walk across at a normal pace. The mistress did not walk across at all.
She said with no shame whatsoever, and she liked to say it loud so everyone could hear, that she could not step where filth had stepped. The bridge, according to her, was full of the trace of dirty people. Slaves coming and going, travelling peddlers, caboclos, lowly folk who walked barefoot and stained the wood with what she called the stench of vile people. So every time she needed to cross, the mistress would call the slave. She would climb onto her back and she would order her to carry her from one side to the other without touching a single finger to the railing, without a single foot of her own touching the wood of the bridge. It was a ritual that repeated itself every time there was a visit at the friend's house, every time there was Sunday Mass, every time there was a Saint's Day festival, every time the mistress simply wanted to demonstrate that she could, that she was who she was, and the slave was the slave. The first time it happened, the slave was 20 years old. She had already been on the plantation for 3 years, and when the mistress said, in front of 2 friends who had come to visit, "Bend down there, I'm going to mount you," the slave thought she was hearing things wrong. She looked at the mistress. The mistress looked back, and there was no joke in that look at all. The slave bent down. The mistress mounted. She was heavy, far heavier than she looked. Not because of her body, the mistress was small, but because of the attitude. She mounted the way someone mounts a thoroughbred horse, with her hands gripping the slave's shoulders like reins. And she said, loud, to her friends, "Let's see if this one can take it." The slave took it. She crossed the bridge with her heart pounding in her throat, with her breath held tight, with her legs trembling from contained rage. Because there, in that moment, she could not stumble, she could not slip, she could not fail. If she failed, she would be beaten. If the mistress fell, she would pay with her skin. So she crossed, slow, steady, with her eyes fixed on the dark wood. And when she reached the other side, the mistress climbed off, smoothed her dress, and said to the laughing friends, "See, stronger than many a mule." The friends laughed. The slave did not. That first crossing became all the others. There were dozens. There were hundreds. In 11 years, the slave lost count of how many times she carried that woman across the bridge. She carried her in scorching sun, with sweat running into her eyes. She carried her in the cold, with her feet freezing on the cold wood. She carried her sick, with fever, with cramps, with back pain like a hammer pounding. She carried her pregnant, because yes, she got pregnant once, by a slave from the neighbouring senzala, and the mistress made a point of continuing to mount her until the belly began to show. When it showed, she ordered another slave to carry her, and when the child was born dead, because it was born dead, the mistress said, without looking at her, "Now you go back to serving." And she went back. She went back to bending her spine. She went back to feeling the weight. She went back to crossing the bridge with that woman mounted on her back, the way someone mounts a thing that doesn't feel. And still, she endured. She endured the way someone endures who has nowhere else to go. She endured the way someone endures who has learned, deep in the soul, that complaining changes nothing and that crying only gives others something to laugh at. But there's something that builds up, even when we pretend it doesn't. The weight. Not the weight of the mistress on her back. That was physical, and the body gets used to it. The other weight, the one no one sees, the one that grows slowly, year after year, humiliation after humiliation, and that no scale can measure. That weight, some people carry until they die. Others do not. The day of the rain came. It had rained all night, a heavy rain of Bahian winter, the kind that makes the earth smell of mud and rotted leaves. When the slave woke up, before the first bell of the chapel, the sky was closed like the lid of a pot. She looked through the senzala door and saw the river in the distance, muddier than usual. She thought, today the mistress won't want to cross. She thought wrong, because the mistress had agreed to visit her friend, and to the mistress, agreed was agreed, even if the sky came crashing down. In the middle of the morning, she sent for her. The slave came to the veranda in her serving dress, the apron tied at her waist. The mistress was wearing her visiting dress, the same as always, the one she wore like armour. She looked the slave up and down and said, "Let's go." The slave looked at the sky, and for the first time in 11 years, she said something. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't a shout, it wasn't rebellion. It was a request so small, so quiet that it barely came out of her throat. She said, "Mistress, the ground is slippery. The wood of the bridge is wet. It's dangerous." The mistress looked at her. She looked at her the way you look at a fly that dared land on your plate. Her eyes narrowed, her mouth, always twisted further. And she said, without raising her voice, without any effort, like someone shooing away that very fly, "Bend down." That was all. One word. The slave bent down. They left the plantation with the fine rain wetting both their dresses. The road to the bridge was about 10 minutes. They passed the cane fields, the cattle pen, the old tree where, it was said, a slave had been hanged in the old days. When they reached the bridge, the rain had thickened. It wasn't fine anymore. It was real rain. And the river down below was angry. The slave stopped at the entrance to the bridge. She looked at the wood. The planks gleamed with wetness. The current beneath made a sound like something hungry. She took a deep breath and, without looking at the mistress, bent her back. The mistress mounted, the same way as always, hands on the slave's shoulders, legs around her waist. The slave began to walk, slow, one step, another step, the planks creaking beneath her bare feet, the rain falling on her face, running down her neck, soaking her clothes. And above her, the mistress stared straight ahead, without looking down, without looking at the river, without looking at the woman who carried her. She stared straight ahead like someone on a platform. The crossing began like all the others, but in the middle of the bridge, something shifted. The slave felt her left foot sink slightly. It wasn't a stumble, it was the wood giving way. An older plank, wetter than the others, at the wrong angle. Her body tilted. She tried to adjust. She shifted her weight to her right foot, and her right foot, in that exact moment, found the same trap. Wet wood at the wrong angle. They both slipped. The slave felt her body falling sideways. Her hands, in a movement that came from the deepest instinct, the kind of instinct that lives in those who know what it is to be near death, and grabbed onto the railing. Her fingers closed on the wood like claws. Her body locked. The mistress did not grab on. The mistress, mounted on her back for 11 years, had nothing to grab onto. She had never grabbed the railing. She had never touched a single finger to the wood of the bridge. It was the ritual. It was the rule. It was the entire humiliation. And when the slave tilted sideways, and when the mistress's body slid down the bent back, the mistress reached out her hands, reached them out into emptiness, into nothing, into air. The slave felt the weight leaving her back. She felt first the physical relief, like someone setting down a stone they had been carrying for hours. Then she heard the sound, a sound she would carry for the rest of her life. The mistress's scream, short, sharp, cut off in the middle, and then a thud down below in the river, a thud muffled by the rain and the current. After that, silence, just the rain, just the river. The slave stood still, her hands still gripping the railing, her fingers white from the squeeze, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't look down, not right away. It took time. It took time that felt like a lifetime. And when she finally looked, she saw the muddy river running on, carrying branches, carrying leaves, carrying things she didn't want to identify. The river does not return what it takes. She stood on the bridge for a long moment, longer than any crossing she had made in 11 years. The rain falling, her back, for the first time in over a decade, with no weight at all on top of it. Her shoulders, she only noticed it later, dropped. They dropped the way they drop when you breathe for the first time in hours, in years, in an entire lifetime. She breathed. Once, twice, slow. It was breath and nothing more. Then she stepped down. She did not go back the way she had come. She walked forward, crossed the rest of the bridge, and stepped down on the opposite side. For the first time in 11 years, her feet touched the floor of the bridge with no weight at all on her back. The planks creaked beneath her, but the creak was different. It was the creak of someone walking for herself, not of someone walking for two. She crossed, alone. When she reached the other side, she stopped. She looked back, at the bridge, at the river that kept running muddy and furious, and she said nothing. She didn't cry, she didn't smile, she didn't pray. She stood there, with the rain running down her face, with her fingers sore from gripping the railing, with 11 years of weight slowly leaving her body like a tide pulling back. Then she walked. She returned to the plantation. When she arrived, she told them what had happened. The mistress had slipped. She had fallen into the river. She had tried to hold her but couldn't. One of her hands had flown to the railing on instinct, and the other wasn't enough. The overseer looked at the sky. He saw the rain. He looked at the bridge in the distance. He looked at the slave, at her fingers scratched by the railing, at her soaked dress, at her eyes that were not red from crying, but red from something else, something he could not put a name to. He said nothing. He sent other men down to the river to search. They searched for 3 days. They found nothing. The river that winter had carried things far, very far, to places the men of the plantation did not go. And after 3 days, they declared the mistress dead.
No one blamed the slave.
Everyone had seen the rain. Everyone had heard the warning, because the slave had warned them on the veranda in front of other people that the bridge was dangerous. The mistress's friends, when they heard, made faces of pity, but in corners they whispered that this was what came of it, crossing a bridge that way on a rainy day, mounted like a queen with no throne, was asking the river to do what it did. The overseer, many months later, said to his wife, "It was fate." The wife agreed. The slave stayed on the plantation for a while longer. She worked, she served, she washed, she cooked, but she never carried anyone on her back again. She never crossed that bridge again. When she needed to go to the village, she went around. She took a longer path, one that crossed the shallow stream, one that had stones to step on. People asked her why, and all she said was, "I've carried enough," and then she would fall silent. The bridge stayed. The planks went on creaking. Others crossed after. Slaves, peddlers, caboclos, lowly folk who walked barefoot and who, according to the mistress, stained the wood with the stench of vile people. They crossed free. They crossed standing up. They crossed looking at the river without fear, because the river only takes from those who owe. The slave, years later, was given her freedom. She left that plantation with the clothes on her back and with one thing she carried for the rest of her life. Not the weight that had stayed on the bridge, but the memory of the weight. The recollection of 11 years bent over. The sound of the thud in the river. The silence that came after. And when, in old age, she told this story to her grandchildren, she always ended it the same way. She would say, softly, like someone telling a secret, "The river does not return what it takes." And then she would fall silent, looking at some point on the wall, with eyes seeing things no one else could see, seeing an old bridge, seeing a fine rain, seeing a woman with her hands stretched out into emptiness, into nothing, into air, seeing, at last, the exact moment when 11 years of humiliation met the only scale that takes its measure without asking, the scale of water, the scale that picks no side, the scale that, in the end, returns to each one the weight they carried on top of others. The bridge still exists, they say, or it did, until not so long ago. On an old plantation in the Reconcavo of Bahia, where the cane no longer grows, where the big house has fallen, where the river changed course and grew gentler, they say that those who pass by still hear, on days of fine rain, a creaking in the wood. the creak of an old plank, a creak like a warning, like memory, like the sound of something carried for too long and that, in the end, found a place to rest. The river does not return what it takes, and there are weights that, when they fall, do not come back.